The thunder of hooves against the packed earth announced Warren Caldwell's arrival to Downieville long before she came into view, her chestnut mare pushing through exhaustion as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Sierra Nevada foothills. It was July 1858, and Warren had ridden for 3 days straight, stopping only when absolutely necessary, her desperation driving her forward even as her body begged for rest. "Whoa, girl," she murmured, patting the mare's sweaty neck as they slowed to a trot upon reaching the main street of the mining town. Downieville had sprouted up during the gold rush of '49, and though the initial frenzy had calmed, the town still bustled with miners, merchants, and the occasional desperate soul seeking fortune. Warren was not seeking gold. She was seeking justice. Her normally tidy blonde hair had escaped its pins, hanging in tangled strands around her dust-streaked face. At 24, she had never traveled alone before, much less ridden such a distance with such urgency. But 3 days ago, she had received word that they had finally caught him. Preston Irwin, the man accused of murdering the mine owner Mr. Holloway, was being held for trial in Downieville, and Warren was the only person alive who could testify to his innocence. The town's single street was lined with wooden buildings, a general store, saloons, a hotel, and at the far end, the courthouse where Preston's fate would be decided. Warren guided her horse to the livery stable, dismounting with legs so stiff she nearly collapsed. "Need some help there, miss?" The stable hand asked, eyeing her disheveled appearance with suspicion. "I need to board my horse," Warren said, her voice hoarse from the trail dust. "And I need directions to the jail." "Jail's behind the courthouse," the boy said, taking the reins. "But you might want to clean up first. Sheriff don't take kindly to vagrants." Warren pulled herself straighter, dignity overcoming exhaustion. "I am no vagrant. I am here on important business regarding the trial of Preston Irwin." The boy's eyes widened. "The killer? They're hanging him tomorrow, you know." Warren's heart lurched. "Tomorrow? The trial is tomorrow." "Trial's today, miss. Started this morning. Hanging's tomorrow at dawn." Without another word, Warren pressed a coin into the boy's hand and took off running down the street, ignoring the stares of the townspeople. Her legs protested with every step, but fear drove her forward. She couldn't be too late. She wouldn't be too late. The courthouse was packed when she burst through the doors, her sudden entrance causing heads to turn. At the front of the room, a man stood in the defendant's box, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a week's growth of beard shadowing his strong jaw. His wrists were shackled, but he stood straight and proud. Preston Irwin looked nothing like a killer, despite the accusation that had brought him here. "Order!" the judge was shouting, banging his gavel as Warren pushed her way through the crowd. "Your Honor," she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have evidence regarding this case. I am a witness for the defense." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Preston's head snapped up, his eyes finding hers across the room. For a moment, recognition flashed across his features, followed by something Warren couldn't name: relief, perhaps, or fear. "Young woman," the judge said sternly, "this court is in session. You will wait your turn or be removed." "There is no defense, Your Honor," the prosecutor said smoothly. "The defendant has no lawyer and has offered no witnesses." "I am his witness," Warren insisted, stepping forward. "Warren Caldwell from Sacramento. I saw what happened the night Mr. Holloway was killed." The judge studied her for a long moment, taking in her travel-stained appearance and the determined set of her jaw. "Very well, Miss Caldwell. Since Mr. Irwin has chosen to represent himself, we will hear your testimony. But first, this court will recess for 1 hour. I suggest you use that time to make yourself presentable." As the courtroom began to empty, Warren stood her ground, her eyes locked with Preston's. He was led away by the sheriff, but not before he mouthed 2 words to her: "Thank you." Warren found herself directed to the town's only hotel by a sympathetic court clerk. She used the last of her money to secure a room for the night and the use of a bath. As she scrubbed away the trail dust, she rehearsed what she would say, how she would explain the events of that terrible night in Sacramento 3 months ago. She had been working as a companion to Mrs. Holloway, the sickly wife of the wealthy mine owner. Preston had been hired as a ranch hand on the Holloway estate. Warren had seen the argument between Holloway and Preston that night, had seen Holloway strike Preston and reach for his gun. She had seen Preston defend himself, pushing Holloway away, seen the older man stumble and hit his head on the corner of his desk. And she had seen the real killer, Holloway's business partner, James Keene, enter the study after Preston fled, finish what the fall had started by strangling the unconscious Holloway, and then raise the alarm, blaming Preston for the murder. Mrs. Holloway had begged Warren to stay silent, fearing Keene's influence. But 2 weeks ago, the sickly woman had finally succumbed to her illness, her last words urging Warren to set things right. Only then had Warren discovered that Preston had been captured and brought to Downieville for trial. Clean and dressed in her one spare dress, Warren made her way back to the courthouse. The room was even more crowded now, word having spread about the mysterious woman witness. She took her seat near the front, ignoring the stares and whispers. Preston was brought back in, his eyes immediately finding hers. He looked cleaner now too, as though the jailer had allowed him to wash before returning to court. Despite his shackles and the gravity of his situation, he carried himself with quiet dignity. "The court will come to order," the judge announced. "Miss Caldwell, please approach and be sworn in." Warren stood, walking steadily to the witness stand. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down, folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. "Miss Caldwell," the judge said, "please tell the court what you witnessed regarding the death of Edward Holloway." Taking a deep breath, Warren began her story, her voice growing stronger with each word. She described the argument, Holloway's aggression, the accident that had rendered him unconscious, and finally what she had witnessed Keene do after Preston fled. "Mr. Keene strangled Mr. Holloway?" the prosecutor asked incredulously when she finished. "And you expect this court to believe that you witnessed this crime yet said nothing for 3 months?" "I was afraid," Warren admitted. "Mr. Keene is a powerful man in Sacramento. He threatened Mrs. Holloway, saying he would ensure she lost everything if anyone spoke against him. She was very ill, dependent on Mr. Keene's goodwill after her husband's death. I promised her I would stay silent until—" "Until what, Miss Caldwell?" "Until she passed away," Warren said softly, "which she did 2 weeks ago. Her last wish was that I tell the truth and save an innocent man from hanging." The prosecutor approached the stand, his expression skeptical. "Miss Caldwell, what was your relationship with the defendant?" "I had no relationship with Mr. Irwin beyond occasionally seeing him on the Holloway estate. He worked with the horses. I attended to Mrs. Holloway." "Yet you risked everything to ride alone for days to testify on his behalf?" Warren lifted her chin. "I risked everything for the truth, sir, as any decent person would." The questioning continued for hours, the prosecutor trying to poke holes in her story, suggesting improper motives, even implying that she and Preston had been lovers plotting Holloway's demise. Through it all, Warren held firm, her clear gaze never wavering, her story never changing. Finally, the judge called for closing arguments. The prosecutor emphasized the circumstantial evidence against Preston, his flight from the scene, the argument witnesses had overheard earlier that day, his capture while trying to leave California. When Preston's turn came, he stood slowly, his shackles clinking in the hushed courtroom. "I ain't much for speeches," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. "I worked for Mr. Holloway for 6 months. He was not a kind employer, but I needed the work. That night, he accused me of stealing from him, which I didn't do. He hit me, pulled his gun. I pushed him away in self-defense, and he fell. I thought he was just knocked out. I ran because I figured nobody would believe a ranch hand over a man like Keene, who was already there pointing the finger at me. He paused, looking directly at Warren. I don't know why this lady is risking everything to tell the truth, but I'm mighty grateful she is. That's all I got to say. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood, paper in hand. We find the defendant, Preston Irwin, not guilty of the murder of Edward Holloway. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry shouts. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Warren sat very still, relief washing over her in waves so powerful she felt lightheaded. Across the room, Preston's shoulders sagged as the tension drained from his body. Order! Order in the court! The judge demanded. When the room finally quieted, he continued, Mr. Irwin, you are free to go. This court will send a telegram to the Sacramento authorities regarding the testimony against James Keene. He banged his gavel once more. Court is adjourned. As the crowd dispersed, Warren remained seated, suddenly unsure what to do next. She had accomplished what she came for, but had given little thought to what would come after. Her position with the Holloways was gone, her meager savings spent on the journey here. Her family in Boston had disowned her when she had chosen to travel west as a companion rather than marry the middle-aged banker they had selected for her. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Preston approached her slowly, his shackles removed, rubbing his wrists where they had chafed his skin. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a deep blue, like the Sierra Nevada sky after a storm. Miss Caldwell, he said, his voice gentle, I don't rightly know how to thank you. Warren stood, smoothing her skirts nervously. There's no need for thanks, Mr. Irwin. I only did what was right. Few folks would have done the same. He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. The sheriff tells me Keene's put a bounty out not just on me now, but likely on you too, once word gets back to Sacramento. Warren felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't considered that Keene would come after her, but of course he would. Her testimony could hang him if the authorities believed her. I see, she said faintly. Preston shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. I've got a small spread about 2 days' ride from here. Nothing fancy, just a cabin and some land I've been working when I'm not hiring out. It ain't safe for you to go back to Sacramento, and I reckon you saved my life today. He cleared his throat. What I'm trying to say is, you're welcome to stay at my place until things settle down. I can sleep in the barn. Warren stared at him, weighing her limited options. Go back to Sacramento and face Keene's wrath? Try to find work in Downieville, where she knew no one, or accept the offer of shelter from this man she had just helped free. That's very kind, she began carefully, but I wouldn't want to impose. It ain't imposing when I owe you my life, Preston interrupted. Besides, seems to me we both could use a friend right about now. A friend. The word struck Warren with unexpected force. It had been a long time since she'd had a true friend, someone who stood by her without expectation or obligation. Yes, she said finally. I suppose we could. They left Downieville the next morning. Preston having purchased supplies with money the sheriff had returned to him upon his release. Warren rode her chestnut mare while Preston rode a sturdy bay gelding he'd bought from the livery. The journey to Preston's homestead took them through winding mountain trails and dense forests, the July heat tempered by the higher elevation. They traveled mostly in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, stopping occasionally to rest the horses or eat a simple meal of jerky and biscuits. On the evening of the second day, they crested a hill, and Preston reined in his horse. There it is, he said, nodding toward the valley below. Warren followed his gaze. Nestled against the backdrop of towering pines was a small cabin, a barn, and a corral. A creek wound its way through the property, and in the fading light, she could make out a small garden plot and what looked like the beginnings of a wheat field. "It's lovely," she said, and meant it. After the dust and noise of Sacramento and the tension of Downieville, the peaceful homestead looked like paradise. "It ain't much," Preston said, but she could hear the pride in his voice. "Been working it for about 2 years now, when I ain't taking odd jobs for extra money." They rode down to the cabin as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Up close, Warren could see that the cabin was rough but solid, built with care if not expertise. Preston helped her dismount, then led the horses to the corral, promising to properly stable them after he'd shown her inside. The cabin was a single room with a stone fireplace at one end. A bed stood in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in another, and a small kitchen area with a cast iron stove completed the sparse furnishings. Everything was neat and clean, if simple. "Like I said, I'll sleep in the barn," Preston said, looking awkward as he stood in the doorway. "There's a loft up there that's comfortable enough." "Mr. Irwin—" "Preston, please," he interrupted. "After what we've been through, seems silly to stand on formality." Warren smiled slightly. "Preston, then. And I'm Warren." "Warren," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. "Don't believe I've ever met a lady with that name before." "My father wanted a son," she explained, the familiar story rolling off her tongue easily. "When I arrived instead, he gave me the name he'd chosen anyway. My mother added and as my middle name, but no one ever uses it." Preston nodded, seeming to find nothing strange about this. "Well, Warren, make yourself at home. I'll tend to the horses and bring in your bags." Left alone, Warren explored the cabin more thoroughly. Despite its simplicity, there were touches that spoke of care: a small bookshelf with a dozen well-worn volumes, a handmade quilt on the bed, a vase of wildflowers on the table. She ran her fingers over the book spines, surprised to find classics like Shakespeare and Dickens among practical manuals on farming and horse care. When Preston returned with her saddlebags, he found her examining his small library. "My ma taught school back in Missouri," he explained, seeing her surprise. "Made sure I knew my letters and numbers, even when Pa said it was a waste for a boy who'd just be working the land." "She would be proud of you, I think," Warren said. Something like pain flashed across his face. "Hope so. Yellow fever took her and my little sister when I was 14. Pa followed a few years later, lung sickness from working in the mines." "I'm sorry," Warren said softly. Preston shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with sympathy. "That's life. What about your folks? You mentioned your father wanted a son." Warren's expression closed slightly. "My parents are alive and well in Boston. We don't correspond anymore." Preston seemed to sense the story behind her carefully neutral words but didn't press. Instead, he busied himself starting a fire in the hearth and preparing a simple supper of beans, salt pork, and the last of the biscuits from their journey. They ate at the small table, the silence between them no longer awkward but thoughtful. When they finished, Warren insisted on washing the dishes, using water Preston had drawn from the well outside. "I'll head out to the barn now," Preston said when everything was cleaned and put away. "There's a bar for the door there, and my rifle's beside the bed if you need it." "Thank you," Warren said, "for everything." He nodded once, then slipped out into the darkness, leaving Warren alone with her thoughts. The days fell into an easy rhythm. Preston worked his land from dawn till dusk, planting, repairing fences, tending to the small herd of cattle he kept in the higher pastures. Warren, raised in a wealthy household and then employed as a companion, had few practical skills for homestead life, but she was a quick learner and eager to contribute. She took over the cooking and cleaning, expanded the vegetable garden, and even learned to milk the single cow Preston kept near the barn. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes reading aloud from Preston's books, sometimes just talking about their days. They carefully avoided discussing the events that had brought them together or what might happen when word reached them about Keene. Instead, they shared stories from their past. Preston's travels after leaving Missouri, Warren's journey west as companion to an older woman who had died in San Francisco, leaving Warren to find new employment with the Holloways. As July turned to August, Warren found herself settling into life at the homestead with surprising ease. The work was hard but satisfying, the isolation peaceful rather than lonely. And Preston, for all his initial awkwardness, proved to be a thoughtful companion, respectful of her space, appreciative of her efforts, and possessed of a dry wit that often surprised a laugh out of her when she least expected it. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Preston broke their unspoken agreement not to discuss the future. "Harvest will be coming in another month or so," he said, his eyes on the distant mountains. "After that, might be safe for you to think about moving on, if that's what you want." Warren's hands stilled in her lap. She had been mending one of Preston's shirts, a domestic task she would have scorned in her previous life but now found soothing. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No," he said quickly, turning to look at her. "No, that ain't it at all. Just don't want you feeling trapped here. You saved my life. Not signed on to be a homesteader's wife." The word wife hung in the air between them, though Preston had never made any improper advances or even hinted at such feelings. He had been a perfect gentleman, sleeping in the barn despite the increasingly cool nights, never entering the cabin without announcing himself first. "I don't feel trapped," Warren said carefully. "In fact, I've been happier here than I can remember being in a long time." Preston studied her face in the fading light, as though searching for the truth behind her words. Yes, she confirmed. "I know it's not conventional, and I know people would talk if they knew our arrangement, but I'm not ready to leave. Not yet." She hesitated, then added softly, "Unless you want me to go." "No," Preston said, his voice rough. "I don't want that at all." They fell silent again, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. The next day, they rode into the nearest town for supplies. It was a small settlement, little more than a general store, a saloon, and a handful of houses, but it served the needs of the scattered homesteaders in the area. Preston had avoided larger towns since their departure from Downieville, wary of news from Sacramento. While Preston loaded their purchases into the wagon he had borrowed from a neighbor for the journey, Warren browsed the general store's limited selection of fabrics. She was examining a bolt of blue calico when she overheard two men talking near the counter. "Heard they finally caught that fella from Sacramento," one was saying. "The one who really killed that mine owner." Warren froze, her fingers tightening on the fabric. "Keene, wasn't it?" the other man replied. "Story is, he tried to run when they came to arrest him. Shot a deputy before they brought him down. Dead. As a doornail. Saved the hangman a job, I reckon." Warren set down the fabric and moved casually closer to the men, pretending to examine a display of buttons. "What about that cowboy they almost hung for it?" the first man asked. "Irwin, I think his name was. Free and clear, from what I heard. Him and that woman witness both. Sacramento Star had the whole story last week." Warren's heart pounded in her chest. Keene was dead. The threat was over. She and Preston were safe. She purchased the blue calico with hands that trembled slightly, then hurried outside to find Preston. He was securing the last of their supplies in the wagon when she reached him. "Preston," she said breathlessly, "I just overheard Keene is dead. He was killed resisting arrest." Preston straightened, his expression shifting from surprise to relief. "You're sure?" The men in the store were discussing it. Apparently, it was in the Sacramento newspaper last week. They stood looking at each other, the implications sinking in. They were free to go wherever they wanted, do whatever they chose without looking over their shoulders. "Well," Preston said finally, "that's good news." "Yes," Warren agreed, though she felt strangely unsettled. "It is." The ride back to the homestead was quiet, each lost in thought about what this development meant for their future. Warren found herself stealing glances at Preston's profile as he drove the wagon, wondering what he was thinking, what he wanted now that obligation no longer bound them together. That evening, after they had unloaded the supplies and returned the wagon, Preston didn't immediately head to the barn as usual. Instead, he lingered in the cabin, helping Warren prepare supper. Their movements around the small space a practiced dance after weeks of cohabitation. As they ate, Preston finally broke the silence. "So, what will you do now?" Warren looked up from her plate. "What do you mean?" "Now that Keen's gone, you're free to go back to Sacramento if you want, or anywhere else." Warren set down her fork. "What do you want me to do, Preston?" He met her gaze directly. "I want you to stay, but only if it's what you want to, not because you feel obliged or because you don't have other options." "And if I stayed?" Warren asked carefully. "What would that mean? Would I continue sleeping in the cabin while you sleep in the barn? Would I be your housekeeper? Your friend? Something else?" A flush crept up Preston's neck. "I ain't good with words, Warren. But I think you know I care for you as more than just a friend or someone I'm obliged to protect." Warren's heart quickened. "I care for you too," she admitted. "These past weeks have shown me a different kind of life than I ever imagined for myself, and I've found happiness in it, in being here, with you." Preston reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. "Then stay. Not as my housekeeper or because you have nowhere else to go. Stay because this is where you want to be." Warren turned her hand to lace her fingers with his. "I will. But Preston, if I stay, I don't want you sleeping in the barn anymore." His eyes widened slightly, and the flush deepened. "Warren, I wouldn't presume—" "I'm not presuming anything either," she interrupted. "But it's your home, your bed. I've imposed long enough. We can find a proper arrangement." "The only proper arrangement," Preston said slowly, "would be marriage. Is that something you'd consider? Being married to a simple rancher with not much to offer but hard work and a small piece of land." Warren felt a smile spreading across her face. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Irwin?" "I suppose it is, Miss Caldwell," he replied, a smile tugging at his own lips. "Not a very romantic one, I'm afraid." "On the contrary," Warren said softly, "I find honesty far more romantic than flowery words or grand gestures." Preston stood, still holding her hand, and came around the table to kneel beside her chair. "Then let me be honest. I love you, Warren Caldwell. I think I started falling for you the moment you burst into that courtroom, travel-worn and determined to save a man you barely knew. Every day since then has only made me love you more, your courage, your kindness, the way you've embraced this hard life without complaint. I'd be honored if you'd consent to be my wife." Warren felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Preston Irwin." He rose and pulled her to her feet, his arms encircling her waist. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, reverent almost, but with a current of deeper feeling that made Warren's heart race. When they finally parted, both were breathing a little faster, their faces flushed with more than just the heat from the fire. "I should still sleep in the barn," Preston said reluctantly, "until we're properly married." Warren nodded, though she was tempted to argue. "How soon can we arrange it?" "We could ride to the settlement on Sunday," he suggested. "The circuit preacher will be there. It won't be fancy." "I don't need fancy," Warren assured him. "Just you." They were married that Sunday in the small church at the settlement, with only a handful of neighboring homesteaders as witnesses. Warren wore her new blue calico dress, which she had stayed up late sewing by candlelight. Preston wore his one good shirt and had trimmed his beard for the occasion. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Preston kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. That night, back at their cabin, their home, they came together as husband and wife, discovering each other with gentle hands and whispered words of love. In Preston's arms, Warren found a passion she had never known existed, a completion that went beyond the physical to touch something deeper in her soul. As they lay together afterward, Warren's head on Preston's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From a privileged but constrained life in Boston, to the uncertainty of life as a companion, to the danger of standing witness for a stranger, to finding love and purpose on a small homestead in the mountains. "What are you thinking?" Preston murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to exactly where we're meant to be," Warren replied, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. He smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I reckon that's true, though I never expected my journey to include nearly being hanged." Warren shuddered slightly at the memory. "Let's not talk about that. It's behind us now." "Thanks to you," Preston said solemnly. "You stood for me when no one else would. I won't ever forget that, Warren. And you gave me a home when my own family had turned their backs on me," she replied. "We're even." Preston chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly under her ear. "I got the better end of that bargain, I think." As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold, Warren and Preston settled into married life with a contentment that deepened with each passing day. The harvest was brought in, the animals prepared for winter, and the cabin made snug against the coming cold. Warren wrote to her parents in Boston, informing them of her marriage and her happiness, not expecting a reply but feeling the need to close that chapter of her life properly. To her surprise, a letter came back not warm, but not entirely cold either. Her mother expressed cautious well wishes and a hope that someday they might meet the man Warren had chosen. "Would you want that?" Preston asked when she shared the letter with him. "For them to visit?" Warren considered the question seriously. "Perhaps someday. They would have to accept that this is my life now, that I'm not coming back to Boston or to their way of thinking." Preston nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. Warren had told him about her parents' attempts to marry her off to a man 3 times her age, about their fury when she had accepted a position as a companion instead, about the final bitter argument that had ended with her father declaring she was no longer his daughter if she chose to go west. "Well, they'd be welcome if they came," Preston said, pulling her close. "Anyone who helped make you the woman you are can't be all bad." Warren laughed, leaning into his embrace. "You might reserve judgment until you meet my father." Winter came early that year, blanketing the mountains in deep snow by mid-November. The days grew short, the nights long and cold, but inside the cabin, Warren and Preston created their own warmth. They read by the fire in the evenings, Preston's deep voice bringing Shakespeare's sonnets to life in a way Warren had never experienced in Boston drawing rooms. They made love in their sturdy bed, learning each other's bodies with increasing intimacy and delight, and they planned for the future improvements to the cabin, expansion of the herd, perhaps even children someday. It was during one of those snowbound days in early December that Warren first suspected she might be carrying a child. She had been feeling unusually tired, and certain foods that she normally enjoyed now turned her stomach. When her monthly courses failed to arrive, she was almost certain She waited a week before sharing her suspicion with Preston, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. When she finally told him, his reaction was everything she could have wished for, joy mixed with tender concern. His large hands gentle as they cradled her still, flat stomach. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." Warren covered his hands with hers. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Preston assured her, his eyes suspiciously bright. Scared, excited, proud, all of that and more. As winter deepened, so did their preparation for the child that would arrive in summer. Preston worked tirelessly on an addition to the cabin, a small second room where the baby would sleep when old enough to leave their bed. Warren sewed tiny garments from fabric they had traded with neighbors for, and crafted a cradle from a large wooden crate Preston had lined with soft pine. Their closest neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, a motherly woman with 6 grown children of her own, became Warren's confidant and guide through the mysteries of pregnancy and childbirth. She lived 3 miles away, close by frontier standards, and made the journey to check on Warren whenever the weather permitted. "You're carrying high," Mrs. Jenkins declared during one visit in late March, her experienced hands feeling Warren's now prominent belly. "Could be a boy." Warren exchanged a smile with Preston, who was pretending to be occupied with mending a bridle but was clearly hanging on every word. "As long as the baby is healthy, we don't mind either way," she said. "That's the right attitude," Mrs. Jenkins approved. "Though I suspect this one here wouldn't mind a son to help with the ranch work." She nodded toward Preston. Preston looked up from the bridle. "A daughter would be just as welcome," he said firmly. "She'd be smart like her mother, and I'd teach her to ride and rope same as any boy." Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow but smiled approvingly. "Modern thinking. I like it." As spring thawed the mountain passes and brought new growth to the land, Warren's belly swelled with their growing child. Despite the discomforts of pregnancy, she had never been happier. Each kick and flutter reminded her of the life they had created together, the family they were building far from the constraints of her past. Preston doted on her, insisting she rest more and taking on many of her usual tasks in addition to his own. Warren tried not to let him coddle her too much, knowing how much work the spring planting required, but she appreciated his concern and love. In early June, with the baby's arrival only weeks away, Preston rode into the settlement to arrange for the midwife to stay with them when Warren's time came. While there, he collected their infrequent mail, including a letter addressed to Mrs. Preston Irwin in an elegant hand Warren recognized immediately. "It's from my mother," she told Preston when he returned, turning the envelope over in her hands. The Boston postmark was dated nearly 2 months earlier. "Do you want me to leave you alone to read it?" Preston offered. Warren shook her head. "No, stay. Whatever it says, good or bad, I want you with me." With slightly trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of expensive stationery. As she read, her expression shifted from apprehension to surprise to something like cautious hope. "What is it?" Preston asked when she finally looked up. "They're coming," Warren said, hardly believing the words. "My parents are coming to visit. Mother writes that they've been thinking about what I said in my letters, about my happiness here. Father's health hasn't been good, and the doctors recommended a change of air. They've decided to travel west this summer." "Here," Preston clarified. "To our home." Warren nodded, scanning the letter again. "They'll be in San Francisco in late July, then travel on to see us. Mother asks if that would be convenient." She looked up at Preston, uncertain. "The baby will only be a few weeks old by then." Preston took her hand, squeezing it gently. "If you want to see them, then they're welcome. We can make up the addition for them to sleep in and move the cradle in here with us." "Are you sure? My father can be difficult." "I'm sure," Preston said firmly. "They're your family, Warren, And family should be together, if they can mend what's broken. Warren felt tears welling in her eyes, the easy tears of pregnancy, but also genuine emotion at her husband's generosity of spirit. "I love you," she said simply. Preston smiled, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I love you too. Both of you." He placed his free hand on her rounded belly, and as if on cue, the baby kicked against his palm, making them both laugh. The baby came on a hot July morning, after a labor that lasted through the night and into the dawn. Preston had ridden for the midwife at the first signs, then paced anxiously outside the cabin as the hours stretched on, the women inside allowing him only brief visits to hold Warren's hand between contractions. When the sharp cry of a newborn finally pierced the early morning air, Preston nearly wore out the floorboards rushing to the door. The midwife met him with a tired smile. "You have a son, Mr. Irwin. A strong, healthy boy. You can go in now." Warren was propped up in their bed, her face pale and damp with sweat but radiant with a joy Preston had never seen before. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in the soft blanket Mrs. Jenkins had gifted them. "Preston," Warren said softly as he approached, her voice hoarse from hours of effort, "come meet your son." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on the tiny red face visible among the blankets. A shock of dark hair, still damp from birth, curled against the baby's forehead. As Preston watched, the infant yawned, his small mouth forming a perfect O. "He's perfect?" Preston whispered, afraid to touch the miraculous creature his wife had brought into the world. "Just like his mother." Warren smiled, shifting the bundle slightly. "Would you like to hold him?" With hands that trembled slightly, Preston accepted his son, cradling the tiny body with a care he usually reserved for handling the most delicate of his tools. The baby weighed almost nothing in his arms, yet Preston felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, a welcome burden, a blessed one. "What shall we call him?" Warren asked, watching the two most important people in her world get acquainted. Preston studied the small face, seeing hints of Warren in the shape of the nose, perhaps something of himself in the strong chin. "What about Edward?" he suggested. "After your father?" Warren's eyes widened in surprise. "You would do that? Even after everything I've told you about him?" "He gave me you," Preston said simply. "Whatever else he did or didn't do, I owe him for that. And maybe it'll help mend things when they visit." Tears filled Warren's eyes. "Edward Preston Irwin," she said, testing the name. "It's perfect." The baby stirred in Preston's arms, his tiny fists waving as his eyes fluttered open, revealing a deep blue that might change as he grew older. "Hello, Edward," Preston said softly. "Welcome to the world, son." In the weeks that followed, Preston and Warren adjusted to life with their newborn. The days blurred into nights and back again, marked by feedings and diaper changes and the small milestones that seemed monumental to new parents. The first real smile, the way Edward tracked movement with his eyes, the strong grip of his tiny fingers around Preston's thumb. Warren recovered quickly from the birth, her natural resilience serving her well. By the time they received word that her parents had reached San Francisco and would arrive within the week, she was feeling almost herself again, if perpetually tired from the interrupted nights. The day the Caldwells were expected, Warren was a bundle of nerves, checking and rechecking the cabin to ensure everything was as presentable as possible. Preston had finished the addition just in time, moving Edward's cradle into their room to make space for her parents. "They won't care about the house," Preston assured her, bouncing Edward gently in his arms as Warren fussed with the arrangement of wildflowers on the table. "They're coming to see you and meet their grandson." Warren gave him a look that suggested he didn't understand the complexities of her relationship with her parents, particularly her mother's exacting standards. "You don't know them," she said. "Especially Mother. She notices everything." Preston shrugged, unperturbed. Then she'll notice how happy you are, how healthy our son is, and how much I love you both. That's all that matters. Before Warren could argue further, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Preston handed Edward to her and went to the door, stepping onto the porch as a hired wagon came into view, driven by a young man from the settlement who occasionally delivered goods to the more remote homesteads. Warren joined him on the porch, Edward cradled in her arms, her heart pounding as she caught sight of the two passengers, a dignified older man with silver at his temples and a ramrod straight posture despite the obvious discomfort of the rough journey, and beside him, a slender woman in a traveling dress that, while practical for the frontier, was clearly of finer quality than anything available locally. The wagon drew to a stop in front of the cabin, and for a moment, no one moved. Then Edward let out a small cry, breaking the tableau. "Warren," her father said, his voice gruffer than she remembered. "You look well." "Father," she replied, shifting Edward slightly. "Mother, welcome to our home." Her mother was staring at the baby, an expression Warren couldn't quite interpret crossing her aristocratic features. "Is that your grandson?" Warren confirmed. "Edward Preston Irwin." At the sound of his name, her father's eyes widened slightly. He descended from the wagon with a stiffness that spoke of the long journey and perhaps the health issues her mother had mentioned in her letter. "Edward?" he repeated. "Yes," Warren said, meeting his gaze steadily. "After you." Something shifted in her father's expression, a softening, a vulnerability she had rarely glimpsed in her childhood. "May I?" he asked, approaching the porch with uncharacteristic hesitation. Warren nodded, holding out the baby for her father to see. Edward chose that moment to open his eyes, blinking solemnly at the stranger leaning over him. "He has your eyes," Edward Caldwell said quietly. "The same shape, at least. And your chin, I think," Warren replied, offering the olive branch. Her father nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Perhaps so." Her mother had joined them on the porch, her critical gaze taking in the cabin, the surrounding land, and finally, Preston, who stood slightly apart, allowing the family their moment. "You must be Mr. Irwin," she said, extending a gloved hand with the formality ingrained by decades of Boston society. "Preston, madam," he corrected gently, taking her hand. "Welcome to our home. The journey must have been tiring." "It was. Educational," Mrs. Caldwell replied diplomatically. "I had not fully appreciated the vastness of this country until now." Warren suppressed a smile at her mother's understated response to what must have been a grueling trek for someone accustomed to the comforts of Boston. "Please, come inside," she invited. "I've prepared tea, and you must be hungry after the final leg from town." The next few hours passed in a strange blend of formality and tentative warmth. Warren's parents were clearly taken aback by the simplicity of the cabin, though they made valiant efforts to hide it. Preston, to Warren's relief and gratitude, was unfailingly polite but completely himself, no pretensions, no attempts to impress, just the quiet strength and gentle humor that had won her heart. Edward, for his part, seemed to sense the importance of the occasion, behaving angelically as he was passed from one grandparent to the other. Even Mrs. Caldwell, initially hesitant to hold the infant, was soon cooing nonsense words to him as he regarded her with solemn eyes. That evening, after a supper that Warren had labored over for days, practicing with the limited ingredients available to create something that might please her mother's refined palate, Preston suggested that he and Mr. Caldwell might enjoy a pipe on the porch while the women put Edward down for the night. Warren shot him a grateful look, understanding his intent to give her private time with her mother. As the men stepped outside, an awkward silence fell between the two women. "He seems a good man," Mrs. Caldwell said finally, watching as Warren settled Edward in his cradle. "Your husband," The best, Warren agreed. He's kind and hardworking and honest. And he loves me, Mother. Truly loves me. For exactly who I am. Mrs. Caldwell's expression softened. I can see that. It's evident in the way he looks at you. She hesitated, then added, Your father and I had concerns when you wrote of your marriage. We feared you might have acted hastily, or out of necessity. I married for love, Warren said firmly, though the circumstances that brought us together were unusual, to say the least. Yes, this business with the trial and the murder accusation. Her mother shuddered delicately. It sounds terribly dramatic. Warren couldn't help but laugh. It was. But it led me to Preston, and to this life, which has brought me more happiness than I ever found in Boston drawing rooms. Mrs. Caldwell glanced around the cabin at the simple furnishings, the practical housewares, the evidence of a life lived close to the land. It's very different from what we imagined for you. I know, Warren acknowledged, and I understand why you and Father were angry when I left. But this is where I belong, Mother. With Preston and Edward, in this home we're building together. Her mother was silent for a long moment, her gaze returning to Edward, now sleeping peacefully in his cradle. Your father has been unwell, she said finally. His heart. The doctors say it's weakening, though the journey seems to have done him some good. Warren felt a pang of concern. I'm sorry to hear that. How serious is it? Serious enough that when your letter came, announcing your marriage and then your pregnancy, he decided we could not afford to maintain the breach between us. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes met her daughter's. He may be proud and stubborn, Warren, but he loves you. We both do. Tears welled in Warren's eyes. I've missed you, she admitted. Even when I was angriest, I missed you both. Mrs. Caldwell reached out, taking her daughter's hand in a rare gesture of physical affection. We've missed you too, dear. More than you know. On the porch, Preston and Edward Caldwell had fallen into a companionable silence after initial conversation about the journey west and the changes in the country since the older man had last traveled beyond New England decades earlier. My daughter seems happy, Mr. Caldwell said abruptly. Happier than I've seen her since she was a child. Preston nodded, tamping tobacco into his pipe. I hope she is, sir. I do my best to make her so. This life, Mr. Caldwell gestured at the surrounding wilderness. It's hard, especially for a woman raised as she was. Warren's stronger than she looks, Preston replied. Always has been, I imagine. But yes, it's hard sometimes. Worth it, though. Mr. Caldwell studied him in the fading light. You love her. It wasn't a question, but Preston answered anyway. More than anything. Her and our son. My grandson. Mr. Caldwell seemed to be testing the word, becoming accustomed to it. Named for me, she said. Warren thought it might help mend things between you, Preston explained. And it seemed fitting. Whatever happened in the past, you raised an exceptional daughter. I figured that deserved some recognition. The older man looked surprised, then thoughtful. I made mistakes, he admitted after a moment. Tried to control her life too much, push her into a marriage she didn't want. I thought I knew what was best. Preston struck a match, lighting his pipe before responding. Most fathers think that, I expect. I probably will too when Edward's older. But from what Warren's told me, you also raised her to think for herself, to value education and independence. Those are the qualities that drew me to her. Mr. Caldwell puffed on his own pipe, considering this. Perhaps I did, he conceded, though I never expected those qualities to lead her quite so far from home. For what it's worth, Preston said carefully, I think she's always missed you and her mother. She doesn't speak of it often, but when she does, there's real sorrow there. As there has been for us, Mr. Caldwell acknowledged. He cleared his throat, as if the admission had been difficult. My health isn't what it was. I didn't want to leave this world with things unresolved between us. Preston nodded, understanding the unspoken complexity behind the simple statement. Well, you're here now, and you're welcome to stay as long as you like. Get to know your grandson. Spend time with Warren. The older man looked at him with new respect. That's generous, given how we treated her when she left. Preston shrugged. Family's family, even when they're at odds. Inside the cabin, Warren and her mother had moved on to practical matters, advice about caring for the baby, stories of Warren's own infancy, gentle corrections to some of the folk wisdom Warren had received from Mrs. Jenkins. I've brought some things for you and the baby, Mrs. Caldwell said, moving to the trunk that had been carried in earlier. Nothing extravagant. I understood from your letters that practicality is valued here, but a few items that might make life a little easier. From the trunk came soft baby clothing of a quality Warren hadn't seen since leaving Boston. A beautiful hand-knitted shawl for Warren herself, jars of preserved fruits and spices that were hard to obtain on the frontier, and several books including a volume of children's stories Warren remembered from her own childhood. Mother, these are wonderful, Warren said, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gifts, especially the books. Preston loves to read, and we've both talked about wanting Edward to grow up loving stories as we did. Mrs. Caldwell smiled, clearly pleased by her daughter's reaction. There's one more thing, she said, reaching deeper into the trunk to withdraw a small wooden box. This was meant for your wedding day. Better late than never, I suppose. Warren opened the box to find a delicate gold locket nestled on a bed of velvet. It's beautiful, she breathed, lifting it carefully. It was my mother's and her mother's before that, Mrs. Caldwell explained. I always intended for you to have it when you married. She hesitated, then added, I'm sorry it wasn't there on the day itself. Warren felt tears threaten again. She seemed to cry so easily since Edward's birth, but blinked them away. Thank you, she said simply, clasping the locket around her neck. I'll treasure it. The men returned from the porch then, bringing with them the scent of pipe smoke and the cooler evening air. Preston's eyes immediately sought Warren's, a silent question in them. She smiled, nodding slightly to let him know all was well. We should let you rest, Mr. Caldwell said, noting the darkness outside. It's been a long day for all of us. How long can you stay? Warren asked, suddenly anxious at the thought of their departure when they'd only just arrived. Her parents exchanged a look. We had thought perhaps a week, her mother said. If that's not imposing too much. Not at all, Preston assured them. Stay as long as you like. Warren and Edward would enjoy the company, and I could use an extra pair of hands with the fencing I'm planning to start next week. He glanced at Mr. Caldwell with a grin. If you're interested in seeing how things are done out here, that is. To Warren's surprise, her father looked intrigued rather than offended by the suggestion. I haven't done manual labor in decades, he admitted, but I find I'm curious. Then it's settled, Preston said. You'll stay, help with the fence, and get to know your grandson properly. The weeks stretched into 2, and then 3, as the Caldwells found themselves reluctant to leave the peaceful homestead and their daughter's family. Mr. Caldwell, after initial awkwardness, took to frontier life with surprising enthusiasm, helping Preston with various projects around the property, and even joining him on a hunting expedition that resulted in a deer that would provide meat for the approaching winter. Mrs. Caldwell, for her part, became an unexpected ally to Warren in caring for Edward, her years of managing a household in Boston translating well to the practical challenges of frontier motherhood. The two women developed a new relationship, not quite friends yet, but no longer the adversaries they had been when Warren left home. In the evenings, they would gather on the porch if the weather was fine, or around the fire if it wasn't, sharing stories and plans for the future. Warren watched with quiet joy as her father bounced Edward on his knee, singing the same nonsense songs he had once sung to her, while her mother and Preston discussed books they had both read, finding common ground in their love of literature despite their vastly different backgrounds. "We've been thinking, Mrs." Caldwell said one evening, as they sat finishing a supper of venison stew, "about our return journey." Warren felt her heart sink. Though she had known their visit couldn't last forever, she had grown accustomed to having her parents nearby, to seeing Edward's face light up at the sight of his grandparents. "When will you leave?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "That's the thing," her father said. "We've been discussing whether we might stay through the winter." Warren stared at him in shock. "The whole winter? It would be difficult to travel once the snow comes, Mrs." Caldwell pointed out practically. "And your father seems to be thriving in the mountain air. His breathing is better than it's been in years." "But what about your home in Boston?" Warren asked. "Your responsibilities there?" Her father waved a hand dismissively. "I've retired from the business. Reynolds is managing things admirably. As for the house, it will still be there in the spring." Warren looked to Preston, seeking his reaction to this unexpected proposal. His face revealed nothing but genuine warmth. "You're welcome to stay," he said. "We'd be glad of the company during the winter months. They can be lonely out here." "Are you sure?" Warren pressed, knowing how much Preston valued their privacy and the peaceful rhythm of their life together. "I'm sure," he said simply. "They're family." That night, after her parents had retired to their room in the addition and Edward had been settled in his cradle, Warren and Preston lay in their bed, speaking in hushed tones. "You're really all right with them staying?" Warren asked, her head resting on Preston's chest. "I am," he assured her, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her back. "They're good people, Warren. A bit formal, maybe, and your father can be opinionated, but they love you. And they're falling in love with Edward. How could I deny him the chance to know his grandparents?" Warren propped herself up on one elbow to look at him in the dim light from the banked fire. "When I stood up for you in that courtroom, I never imagined it would lead to this, to us, to Edward, to my family healing after so many years." Preston smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Funny how things work out. You stood as my only witness when everyone else believed the worst of me. Then I got to stand as your only family when yours turned away. And now we have a proper family," Warren marveled. "Larger and more loving than I dared hope for." "We do," Preston agreed, pulling her close again. "And it all started because you were brave enough to tell the truth, even when it was hard." Warren settled against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "I love you, Preston Irwin." "I love you too, Warren Irwin," he replied, the name still new enough to bring a smile to both their lips. "More than you'll ever know." As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold once more, Warren stood on the porch of their cabin, Edward in her arms, watching as Preston and her father worked together to split wood for the coming winter. Her mother was inside, preparing preserves from the last of the garden harvest, humming a Boston parlor song that seemed strangely at home in the wilderness setting. Edward, now nearly 4 months old, babbled happily, reaching for the colorful leaves that occasionally drifted down from the trees surrounding their home. Warren pressed a kiss to his dark curls, inhaling the sweet scent of him, marveling as always at the miracle of his existence. "Your papa is a good man," she whispered to her son, "the best of men. And one day you'll be just like him." As if hearing her thoughts, Preston looked up from his work, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool autumn air. Seeing her watching, he smiled that same smile that had first warmed her heart in a dusty courtroom more than a year ago, when they were strangers bound by nothing more than truth and justice. Now they were bound by so much more, by love, by family, by the shared life they were building day by day in this wild, beautiful place. As Preston set down his axe and walked toward them, Warren felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. "What's this?" Preston asked gently, reaching them and seeing her emotion. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Warren assured him, leaning into his embrace as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Everything is exactly as it should be." And as they stood together, their son between them, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become their home, Warren knew that nothing, not distance, not hardship, not the judgment of others could diminish the gift they had found in each other. From the unlikeliest of beginnings had grown the strongest of bonds, a love that would sustain them through all the seasons of their lives together.